This is the Making Noise podcast.
I mean, the thing that annoys me the most is notes that just don't exist on the instrument. Like things that a textbook, like the Adler textbook, could tell you immediately.
Does that happen a lot?
Yeah, especially on piccolo, because piccolo only goes down to D, and we get a lot of like C and C sharp and Bs, which don't like in they're written C4 and B3, but they spoken C4 or C5 and B4, because the piccolo starts at speaking pitch D5. There is a specific instrument that goes down to the low notes, but they're very specific. They're very hard to find because they're expensive. And that's a very niche market to write for.
Right, yeah.
But like I have a lot of leeway with, especially like avant-garde and extended writing, because there's so little codification of technique, especially for composers' notation. That I can't blame you for using something weird unless you're using X note heads for anything other than key clicks. Those are key clicks. I'm sorry. It's my like one pet peeve with extended writing is that X note heads are key clicks. There's no other option.
Put your foot down on that one.
Yes. But basically, like I basically, when I see a score, if it is clear to me, and as long as there's words and there's a key and I know what's happening, it's fine. Like I will figure out what symbols you used for the things that I'm doing, because everyone uses them differently, and I can't blame you for having a different resource than the one that I learned, kind of thing. But it does have to be clear. If you just put random symbols on a page and don't give me any key or any indication of what the symbols mean, I'm going to walk away.
Right. Yeah, well, that, I mean, yeah. You can't be blamed for that either.
No.
If it's like if it's too challenging to like even navigate on your own, then
yeah,
you know, that's no fault but the composers, really.
Exactly. And I understand, like obviously I work in a very collaborative way, and most of the pieces that are written for me are written with consult from me or from my videos, which kind of codify how I want things to be notated. But I also am a very big proponent of these pieces need to have a life outside of my performance. And if I'm the only one who can read it, then is it really successful? Obviously, like I do a lot of flute and voice playing, and so there's a lot of pieces that are written with a very, very specific vocal range that fits my voice really well. So that's limiting in terms of who can play it outside of that, but that was a choice that we actively made, and someone with a similar vocal range can play this piece. It's just going to be harder to find someone who has a similar vocal range. That's a limitation, and that's something that we always talk about whenever someone's writing for flute and voice is like, hey, do you want this to be played by anyone except me?
Yeah.
Because you can really easily scare people off if it has like a low A in it and they are soprano. But there's also ways around that particular limitation and like allowing for octave transposition and that kind of stuff. But if it's illegible, or only legible in my like specific coded language that I have been like writing in and reading in for as long as I can remember, then that's not fair either.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the challenges with new music is there's no standard way of notating things. There's definitely certain conventions that are common, but not even like typical, I guess. I don't know.
Well, and I also noticed like across instruments, it's different.
Yeah.
Like within the woodwind family, especially like saxophone, especially just because they have such a wide range of contemporary sounds, flute notation and saxophone notation don't always line up, even for the same things. Because for flute, my typical like slap tongue or pizzicato notation is an accent note head. But from what I can tell, that is different for saxophone players. They're not as used to that, or they don't use it as much. I don't even like, I just remember seeing some posts on Facebook about saxophone notation and being like, that's not what I would ever read that as. and
I
the
think
same
you're
sound.
yeah. I've written quite a bit for saxophone, and I've used slap tongue in my music before. And I even like for me in my repertoire alone, I've changed the notation for it.
Hmm.
And I don't think I've ever had a saxophonist tell me like this is not how we read slap tongue.
Yeah.
Like I mean I've used like cross note head, not cross note heads, but like a cross above
Hmm. Yeah,
the
I see that a
stem.
lot.
Yeah, and like even the Bartok pizzicato, like the circle with the
Yeah.
line coming out of it.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
yeah. So there's like, it makes my mind twist a lot.
Right. And I think it's also I kind of like delved into the world of like very avant-garde new complexity 1970s music by playing Fernie Howe. And so I also like I understand that notation better than a lot of others just because I spent like a year of my life on that piece.
Sure.
And I had to be able to read it fluently to be able to effectively play it. And so now I kind of think in that notation, which is an older notation that a lot of people don't want to delve into because Fernie Howe is scary
Hmm.
and his scores are scary to look at. And so they don't always want to use those notations because they like imply this fear.
Mhm.
um, and I also like the fingering charts are always different. Like there's so little codification. That's actually something that I would love to be able to have an influence on is like, can we have something standard for some of these sounds that are not going away? Because you also have like Shirino techniques where he made them up with a flutist and like put them into a piece and now they're standard somehow,
Mhm.
despite the fact that the only person who ever used them previously was him. And so there's all these things that like I don't even know how to notate because the only person who ever notated them is Scurino, and he was writing them for this person who he worked with directly.
Right.
So, yeah, it's. I think to answer your question, my biggest like issue with composers is unclear notation.
You heard it here, crew, composers out there. Be clear about what you're notating when you're asking performers to do something.
Yes.
Yeah, well, even with the Sharino, because I think I know the technique you're talking about. It's like that, like
Bird warble. Yeah, with the
yeah,
right hand trill key. Yeah.
right, yeah, and there's like a descending line or something,
Yep.
but it's like not
Yep.
actually descending.
And the only score I ever found it explained in only explained it in Italian.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
my teacher and I spent like 45 minutes listening to recordings of pieces trying to figure out what the sound was, and eventually she was like, oh, it's the like this trill thing.
Mm.
And I saw it in a piece later on, and I just kind of messaged the composer and was like, hey, just so you know, like I know what this is, it's fine, but you probably want to explain this a little bit better than like Scurino trill in the score, because you literally, that's a kind of a deep cut in terms of not like flute knowledge.
Yeah.
And if you have anyone who isn't a contemporary specialist playing this, and even someone who is a contemporary specialist playing this, they might not know what that is. And the composer was like, oh, I was just like studying this score and I thought it was really cool and I didn't realize how unstandard it was. And I was like, yeah, but yep, that's cool. Please change that.
Well, that's great advice right there. I mean, as like I think especially when it comes to these sort of techniques, and you mentioned having a performer who's not as used to contemporary techniques, being able to explain the technical aspects of the technique, but also the sound of what is being produced.
Yeah.
You know, like so how to do it, and then what it should sound like.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Especially when like some of these, just thinking about flute techniques, like sound and air techniques have so many variables. Because how much air do you want? How little air do you want? Do you want a syllable on it? Do you want just straight noise air? Like what do you want? And I find that composers are never super clear about that. And so that's something that I've been kind of railing on recently is like, hey, if you want to write air techniques, cool, but also like give us an idea of the sound world you're going for. Do you want a certain syllable on it? In which case, say which syllable. If you want it to be 50-50, literally say you want it to be 50-50, and it'll be a lot easier and you'll get a much better performance when the flutist isn't just like, okay, you want an airy tone. what kind of airy tone?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that's actually a little bit of the issues I was facing with the piece that I had written in June, because I used quite a bit of air sounds in that, and like I was like, well, how should I describe this, or how should I notate this, or to what, like, I don't have a flute, so how am I gonna, like
Yeah.
a lot of those issues that we're talking about right now is exactly what I was experiencing.
Right.
Yeah.
Um,
So I'm glad that you mentioned that. That's so
yeah,
important.
and it's one of the reasons that like I make the Contemporary Techniques 101 and the Contemporary Techniques for Composers series, is just there's so many things that you would never think about until you're using them, and then suddenly it's a really big problem because you don't know what to do with them. That it makes sense to have some kind of resource available for composers and also for flutists, to figure out how to learn how to do some of these things, how to write some of these things, and also how to communicate to each other what the problems are. Because that's another thing too, is like there's composer speak and there's performer speak, and it doesn't always line up. And being able to translate to each other what you're trying to express can be very helpful.